Well, thank you again. It is really a great pleasure for me to address today both the Gratz community and our own members of Gesher Galicia, as Paul and others alluded in the introduction, the two communities that share the same passion for learning and studying history and culture of Jewish people. So today we'll dive in for the next 30, 40 minutes into the topic of the battle for Jewish rights. We'll explore the path toward Jewish emancipation in one of the largest countries of the Austrian Empire. And as we meet at this intersection of history, social upheavals, and yes, even genealogy, I am certain that you will find some of the themes resonating with you even today in 2020. Well, let's dive in directly to the place where we spend next half an hour. This is the map of the Austrian Empire in 1840s, as you could see, a country that has a difficulty fitting to a single chart. It spread from Eastern Europe through Central Europe and even part of the Balkans before ending in the West in what we know today as Northern Italy. And let me circle for you here on the top the province of Galicia, which we will visit in a moment. But this map is somewhat deceiving. Those multi-ethnic provinces and lands that were glued for centuries by the imperial power, its military, and yes, provincial bureaucracy dispersed to different provinces from Vienna to the periphery. This empire in 1848, when our story begins, is in a state of impasse. All essentially sections of the society are somewhat dissatisfied. The age of the Enlightenment, of tinkering with political reforms, with free expressions, for which Austria of the previous century, 18th century, was known, came to the standstill by 1840s. This age of enlightenment was replaced with censorship, with maintaining status quo, or even political imprisonment for those who strayed away from official imperial line. All sections of the society in this diverse land are dissatisfied. Jews are particularly faring probably the worst, living still under many restrictive laws, residential restrictions, property rights restrictions. In Galicia and other provinces of the Austrian Empire, the state even interfered with registration of Jewish marriages, and many Galician genealogists of 21st century are very well aware of the complications that led to inter-family trees. So clearly, in a public square, Jews, for both internal and external reasons, were far from being fully integrated in the society around them. Well, this proverbial spark that lit the fire not only in Vienna, but also in other provinces of the Austrian Empire happened on March 13. We are looking here at the images of the boisterous crowds of students and citizens of Vienna who gathered on March 13 in front of a building housing a local parliamentary assembly. And let's see if we can discern some Jewish voices in a crowd. On the top left, you see Karl Heinrich Spitzer, a young, barely 18-year-old Jewish student, a technical student from Moravia, today's Czech Republic. On the right, you see another Jewish man, Adolf Fischow, a Hungarian-born physician who addressed the crowd speaking about the need for a free press, freedom of expression, educational reforms, while others in the crowds demanded constitutional reforms that would enshrine, in a legal sense, the rights of the citizens to participate in state affairs, and they would assure civic and legal equality for all. Well, the mood of the street dramatically changed with the arrival of the military. Shots were fired in the narrow streets of Vienna, and at first 5 men fell to the ground. Among them was a Jewish student, Karl Spitzer, that I mentioned just a minute ago. The same afternoon, the unrest spread to other districts of Vienna, but this time a call for liberal reforms, for changes, was replaced by looting and arson. I'm always perplexed why history is so selective in what to remember and whom to remember. The story of Karl Spitzer would be repeated over the next several months in poems, newspapers. His image, like the one on the slide, will be very well known, not just in Vienna, but throughout farther located provinces. Yet nobody would remember that in the afternoon of the same day, Bernard Herschmann, another Jewish man, a simple weaver, was also killed on the streets of Vienna. So again, history is quite selective what it remembers. The same evening, on March 13, 1848, powerful Clemens von Metternich was forced to resign. Metternich was a foreign minister and state chancellor. In the eyes of the street, he was a symbol of conservatism, of repression, of censorship. And you can see him in this mocking caricature from 1848, fleeing together with demoted chief of police, fleeing for exile. Interestingly, he ended up in exile in England. On the right, you see another caricature from the Times showing Metternich under the label the old system, leaving Vienna behind under these humiliating circumstances. But if the imperial court hoped that purging Clemens von Metternich would quell the streets, they were grossly mistaken. Demonstrations continued on March 14 and 15th. Again, people demanded constitutional reforms, more than symbolic demotion of one of the ministers. It is said that on March 15, feeble Emperor Ferdinand turned to his advisors and said, I quote, tell the people I agree to everything, end quote. And as you could see on those pictures, in the afternoon of March 15th, imperial messengers dispersed through streets of Vienna and read new imperial edict with imperial concessions where emperor promised freedom of the press, allowed citizens to form so-called national guard that would patrol the city streets and separate citizens from the military, and most importantly, emperor promised constitutional reforms, the promise of civil and legal emancipations for all. Well, let's leave the excited streets of Vienna and then move to Galicia. You saw the outline of Galicia on a map of Austrian Empire, but here is a detailed map of Galicia in 1840s. Galicia was, like rest of the empire, multi-ethnic province. The two main ethnic groups were Poles and Ruthenians. You will hear me today using the term Ruthenians rather than Ukrainians. Term Ukrainians came to use only later in the 19th century. Its capital for Austrian Galicia was the city of Lemberg, or Lwów in Polish, or Lviv today in Ukrainian. The second largest city in Galicia was Kraków, located in the western part of the province. Galicia was part of the Habsburg monarchy since 1772. But if we look at the population numbers from 1848, from the year where the battle for Jewish rights unfolded, there were approximately 4.8 million people living in Galicia, making this province the second largest, the second most populous province in this diverse Austrian Empire. But when it came to Jewish community, always about 10, 11% of overall population of the province. So in 1848, about 480,000 Jews made home in Galicia. This was the home of the largest Jewish community in the entire Austrian Empire. Well, in 1848, it took 3 days for a traveler who grabbed this imperial edict, if you see which you see on the left side of the screen, and delivered 3 days later to Lemberg. It was quickly translated to Polish language. I find this somewhat ironic, you probably cannot notice this, that the printer who printed official governmental decrees quickly added in the footnote from Free Press. Well, this is a map of 19th century, mid-19th century Lemberg. In 1840s, more than 60,000 people lived in the city. About 1/3 of the city comprised of Jewish population. If we were to walk through the streets of Lemberg in 1848, we would have no difficulty finding Jews and Jewish sites linked closely to the community. At the bottom of the screen, you see the pictures of what we would call today the Orthodox synagogues. On the right, the great city synagogue. On the left, the great suburban synagogue. But on the top, you see a new addition to synagogues of Lemberg. This was the German Jewish prayer house, later renamed as Progressive Synagogue. The synagogue that opened just 2 years before in 1846 and was led by Rabbi Kohn, whom we will mention in a moment. But Jewish Lemberg was more than synagogues. I'm pointing here to a Jewish hospital just north of that circle, just north of Jewish hospital was the old and ancient Jewish cemetery with tombstones dating back to 14th century, which spoke volumes about Jewish connections, not only to Lemberg itself, but century-long connections with Galicia as a whole. Well, the next day, on March 19th, someone was reading a petition to crowds of people gathering on the streets of Lemberg. A group of Polish nationalists composed a petition to the emperor, building on the imperial concessions, but expanding their demands, demanding far-reaching home rule or autonomy for Galicia that would revive Polish influence in cultural and political affairs. But for the Jews, most important paragraph there was a clear, unequivocal demand for civic and legal emancipation for all inhabitants of the province. In fact, here you see this petition translated into 3 main languages, Polish, Ruthenian, and German, that would be read not just by government officials, but also many Jews on the streets of Lemberg. One of the first who signed the petition was Rabbi Abraham Kohn, a spiritual leader of the synagogue, of the new synagogue that I mentioned before, followed by the members of Jewish community council. The hope for Jewish emancipation clearly resonated with Jews of Lemberg. At the evening of the same day, on March 19th, a crowd at 14,000 people descended on the residence of the governor of Galicia, the highest imperial representative there, and a smaller delegation, including Rabbi Kohn, presented the governor with this petition and also entered into negotiations. What are the next steps to quell unrest on the streets? The same evening and following over the next several days, political prisoners were released from prisons. This one is the scene from Krakow. You see a crowd, enthusiastic crowds greeting released political prisoners. From Jewish sources and non-Jewish sources, we know that Lemberg was in a state of frenzy. Christians hugged Jews, rich embraced poor. In fact, one newspaper described the Jews were throwing flowers at the feet of released prisoners, while the street was responding, "Long live Jews." Scenes like this were unimaginable just a few days before. Well, the movement of 1848, free press, lifting up of censorship, clearly brought new voices to the public square. So let's, for a moment, try to listen to those public square. Well, of course, government still had a public voice. This is a petition of the governor of Galicia from March 21st, so just 2 days from the events that we were just talking about, that is warning citizens of Lemberg against marches, against public gatherings. Well, the next day, a Polish pamphlets flooded streets of Lemberg under the title, "What's Happened in Lvov, What's Happened in Lemberg." Someone describes in a very simple terms this very new, unknown term of civic and legal equality for all. And in fact, Jews are described for the first time as brother Jews on the very first page. Well, 10 days later, a Jewish voice appeared. This is a poem written by a Jewish physician from Lemberg, Moritz Rappaport, who wrote a poem hailing prospect of constitutional reforms and, of course, political amnesty. It's interesting that Moritz Rappaport added here on the first page a little note saying that any proceeds from the sale of this pamphlet would be directed to the needs of just released political prisoners. In the same context, Jews of Lemberg and Jews of Galicia in general, in May of 1848, would see the first Jewish newspaper, as Abraham Mendel Mohr, an editor of this newspaper, wrote, not only written, not only published, but also distributed by the Jews. This newspaper had a simple title, Zeitung, or newspaper. It was written in Yiddish, trying to reach the masses of Jews in Galicia. And we are very thankful to a member of Gesher Galicia, Joshua Grayson, who kindly provided us with very informative translations from a number of issues that we found in one of the Harvard library, essentially forgotten for years. It provides very interesting a window into what type of news Jews of Galicia read in 1848. And I was amazed to discover how quickly, not just local news, but news from other provinces or even international news were reaching in 1848 Jews of Galicia. So again, a front page of Zeitung. But besides Jews writing to Jews or Poles writing to Poles, 1848 brought unusual dialogue, unusual because the Polish-Jewish relationship were always following peaks and valleys over centuries. This was the time, however, when Poles and Jews exchanged in a public discourse through those pamphlets. You see on the left a Polish pamphlet, an appeal to the Israelites. Again, for the first time, Jews are called or addressed, "my dear brothers," in strange mixture of German, Yiddish, and few Polish words that were essentially local vernacular. The writer talks about common history of Jewish people and Poles, and moving to today's events, it encourages Jews to join the national movement of home rule for Galicia that would also promise them a Jewish emancipation. A couple weeks later, Jewish reply comes. Again, it's written in this local vernacular of Yiddish, German, and Polish words, but this time a Jewish writer writes in the rhymed verses, not only acknowledging the past, but focusing on different treatment of Jews in Galicia in 1848, as opposed to other provinces of the Austrian Empire. In fact, in May 1848, the month when this pamphlet was published, Jews of Hungary were denied vote in a local election. Hungarian national movement retreated from earlier promise of Jewish emancipation under pressure from nationalists and public. Well, National Guard that I mentioned before was one of newly won freedom. These were formations of citizens who would serve on the streets of the cities to protect properties, to show perhaps one step into the participation of citizenry in local affairs. But at the same time, the formation of the National Guard is a good testing ground how the egalitarian society would be implemented in a real setting. In Vienna, Adolf Bischoff, this young physician that you saw before, became a commanding officer of Academic Legion. This was the National Guard recruited from university students. In Lemberg, on the first day when the National Guard was formed, 300 Jews signed up for the service. And in fact, we can have a little peek. Who were the Jews who signed up for the service in the National Guards? Due to our collaboration, research collaboration with the Ossolineum Institute in Poland, we found those lists that list the Jews and their occupations. We find shopkeepers, traders, tailors, haberdashers, glove makers, and surprisingly, quite a lot of umbrella makers among the Jews who signed for the service. You could see in the front of this slide just one report from one day of the National Guard service, listing two Jewish junior officers, Samuel Hoppen and Leib Burstyn, who led their patrols comprising of Jews and non-Jews under their command. But let's leave for a moment a noise of the big cities such as Lemberg. Let's move to the periphery. Let's look to the countryside of Galicia and let's ask ourselves the question, was this movement of 1848, as far as Jews are concerned, only confined to the large cities? What about the smaller communities where majority of Jews lived in Galicia? I like this lithograph in particular for a couple of reasons. It shows a specific city in Galicia in the background and smaller towns and townlets in the foreground. This is the place that in many places, in many of those towns, Galician Jews comprised about 50% of the town's population. In the summer of 1848, this place, as the rest of Galicia, is consumed by heated debate. A debate is about the government's proposal to divide Galicia into two parts, one in the west that would have a Polish majority, and the other in the east that would have a Ruthenian majority. Ruthenians are for the division. Poles, of course, are against, that would defy their claim into the entire province. And Jews, attracted by the promise of Jewish emancipations, overwhelmingly sign the protests together with the Poles. And in fact, you see one of many pages of the petition with Jewish and non-Jewish names from this very town that you see in a background. On the right side, you see another page of the petition only with Jewish names written in Hebrew and in Latin script from one of the towns in the foreground of this picture. Jews from all walks of life took part in this political debate in 1848 in Galicia, defying the notion that those Jews from smaller towns remained silent. Well, let me bring a couple of signatures from those petitions. These are the signatures that already some of the members of Gesher Galicia identify as their ancestors, David Schnabel from Kołomia, Ozias David and Leib Rieger at the bottom from Bohorodczany. And there is much more to discover in those records that we recently found in the Austrian state archives. For those of you who are interested in this very interesting documents, though difficult to read, I would encourage you to look for a December issue of our research journal Galicianer, where we will describe those records, and the records will be posted on our website for our own members to investigate, find further whether your ancestors not only were in specific places, but also what they were discussing in those noisy, momentous months of 1848. But whenever social movement spills onto the streets, we all are aware that there is a risk that the good will also bring the bad and the ugly. We talked already about the good, Jewish emancipation, constitutional reforms, free press. Let's talk for a moment about the bad and the ugly. Probably the most benign part of the bad were those nocturnal charivaris, or banging pots and pans under the windows of unpopular city official or police official who, after spending a few sleepless nights to this music of charivari, would pack his bags and leave the city. Much more serious was coarsening of the debate between Poles and Ruthenians. Here you see a petition of Ruthenian national movement demanding from the emperor recognition of their rights to distinct nationality, at the same time voicing their undivided loyalty to the Habsburg dynasty. Ruthenian awakening had its roots in this period of time. The conflict between Poles and Ruthenians would continue beyond 1848. Jewish community certainly was not free of internal strife. On this picture, you see the image of Rabbi Abraham Kohn, spiritual leader of the German Jewish prayer house that we saw before. Rabbi Kohn was highly unpopular among the Orthodox majority of Lemberg. In fact, the conflict between the progressive camp and Orthodox camp reached its new heights when Kohn was appointed by the authorities to the position of district rabbi over a very well qualified candidate advanced by the Orthodox community. In 1848, with the public order breaking down, Rabbi Kohn's house was pelted with stones. He himself was physically accosted on the streets of Lemberg. As many of you are aware, this issue reached its tragic end in September 1848, when Rabbi Kohn and one of his daughters were poisoned, fatally poisoned, by an assassin later on linked to the Orthodox camp. So the good always bring also the bad and the ugly. Well, with political activists, nationalists challenging imperial authority, not just in Galicia, not just in Vienna, but throughout the entire empire, imperial military soon mounted its counteroffensive. You see on the left barricades on the streets of Prague that was quickly brought under military control in June 1848. Much more bloody, much more protracted, where was outburst of violence on the streets of Vienna in October 1848. The war minister was hacked to death by the mob. You see the fire consuming the imperial library. After the military laid the siege on the city, 2,000 lives were lost. And by October 30th, Vienna was under imperial military control. We are looking here at panoramic view of Lemberg in the waning days of October 1848. For now, let me point to you, left to the center, a tower of City Hall, and the hills in a background surrounding the city, both of which, the City Hall and the hills, will play a role in the events that would unfold soon. This picture of graceful, composed city does not reflect anxiety on the streets. People wondered what might happen next. Well, the violence came to Lemberg on November 1st. The fighting erupted between the rebels and the imperial troops in the narrow streets of Lemberg leading to the central market square and City Hall. Imperial artillery started bombardment from those hills that you saw before. And as a result, you see a City Hall here, the building of City Hall, set ablaze. At the bottom is a ghostly skeleton of the university library that burned, and with it, its archive and multiple volumes of books. On November 2nd, commanding officer of Austrian troops in Galicia, General Hammerstein, put forward non-negotiable demands for surrender of Lemberg. And on November 3rd, Lemberg was placed under martial law. Free press came to an end. Lively debates in a public square also were forbidden. 3.5 months ago or so, a governmental commission in February 1849 delivered its detailed report on wounded and killed on the streets of Vienna. And again, we can show you a list of Jewish members of the community wounded and killed due to their productive collaboration with Ossolineum Institute that I mentioned. Among the Jewish victims of November 1848 unrest, we find Abraham Igolnitzer, who was a teacher in the school until recently led by the late Rabbi Abraham Cohn. But it is a story of a Jewish man, a Jewish merchant, only 21-year-old, Ludwig Krasnopolski, that epitomized what it meant to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. He came from city of Brody. Brody was another Galician city, predominantly Jewish, in fact, often referred to as Galician Jerusalem. He came to Lemberg to attend the wedding, and we surmise he was killed by a stray bullet waiting in his hotel for more quiet times to exit. The report was signed by many officials. I will only point to you the signature at the bottom. This is a signature of Dr. Adam Barach. Barach was a Jewish physician from Lemberg who defied many stereotypes attached to Eastern European Jews. He was a member of Jewish Community Council. In fact, he was the one who co-signed employment contract for Rabbi Abraham Cohn. But the reason I'm digressing a little bit is that Adam Barach was also a prolific writer. He wrote an article that I think you will find its title, at least, quite interesting. And the title was about the public trust in the medical profession. I found this title so important to us in the year of COVID-19, about public trust in the medical profession. Well, you saw the pictures of Vienna, you saw the pictures of Lemberg and list of victims from the city, and you might wonder, was everything lost at the end of 1848 when we talked about path to Jewish emancipation, about the battle for Jewish rights? And as always, progress is unstoppable. but we often don't achieve progress, probably most often we don't achieve progress following a straight line, and the same was true for Jewish emancipation. In October 1848, just a couple of weeks before the fighting started in Lemberg, Isaac Noah Mannheimer, who was a rabbi, but at the same time a parliamentary deputy to Austrian parliament representing city of Brody that I mentioned to you, Mannheimer made impassioned speech to parliamentarians saying that the time has come to abolish infamous Jewish taxes on kosher meat, on candles. Mannheimer reasons that this was not a matter of fiscal issues or fiscal miscarriage of justice. This was a stain on the Austrian Empire, the moral stain. His proposal to abolish taxes was overwhelmingly approved by Parliament, and in fact, the same month was signed into the law by the Emperor. Jewish taxes were abolished once and for all. But the progress toward Jewish emancipation was not straight. In December 1848, a young, energetic 20-year-old Franz Joseph ascended to the Habsburg throne. In January 1849, martial law covered entire Galicia, not just city of Lemberg. This rich, energetic Jewish-Polish dialogue fell largely silent, and both groups retreated to their respective corners. In March 1849, Franz Joseph declared his constitution, decreed his constitution. Yes, there was a statement about legal equality of all citizens, but that was just a piece of paper. In fact, Emperor suspended his constitution just 2 years later. Jewish lives in Galicia and elsewhere continued to be complicated by those restrictive laws that we spoke at the beginning. The change started slowly at the end of 1850s and 1860s. Certain occupations opened to Jews. Jews could become now notaries. They could enter occupations within the judicial system. They were allowed to settle in the countryside, which was formerly forbidden. But the real breakthrough came in December 1867, when, facing internal and external challenges, Franz Joseph, whom you see here, still having some hair on his head and in civilian garb, this was in December 1867, Franz Joseph would sign fundamental laws or constitution. As you could see, this constitution carried a number of ethos of the 1848 movement. The 1867 constitution is the point of Jewish emancipation. Certainly, constitution did not erase social biases. Certainly, constitution did not erase anti-Semitism. Certainly, a constitution did not eliminate poverty, particularly in Galicia, but yet it provided very important legal protection for the Jews. Jewish lives dramatically changed over the next half a century. Jews became a part of political and cultural movements. Some Jews advocated, some political organization, cultural organization advocated their allegiance to the pan-Austrian citizenship and German language. Other more powerful organizations recommended adherence to the traditions, published their newspapers in Hebrew. In fact, the Orthodox political party was the largest political party for Jews in Galicia. Toward the end of 19th century, a new generation of Jews recommended immersion, acculturation in Polish language and Polish culture. Other Jews formed Zionist organizations that came to life at the end of 19th century. What was the trickle of Jewish names in the Habsburg universities prior to 1848 would translate toward the end of 19th century and in the beginning of 20th century to thousands of Jews studying in Habsburg universities and seizing these new opportunities. So with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. I leave you with some contact information. And Lori, I think I will turn this over to you, which means that I should stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zalewski. Wonderful, wonderful, fascinating presentation today. There are definitely some parallels to life as we know it today, but also some differences. And I'm glad that we've had a good historical, accurate, and factual look at some of that. And not to mention the fact that you are a great storyteller. Your passion for history is infectious. I think we've all gotten it today. And I do see we have some questions coming up. Before opening up for those questions, I want to remind any of our alumni out there, please don't forget to update your contact information on our website and to join the Gratz Alumni Facebook page. Among those participating on our webinar right now are alumni, current students, Gratz staff and faculty, members of Gesher Galicia, and adult continuing education students of Gratz. So we've tossed a wide net today across the Atlantic as well. If you would like to help strengthen Gratz and make it possible for even more students across the world to participate in our online programs, please consider making a tax-deductible charitable donation. And on behalf of everyone at Gratz, thank you for your participation and your support. So let's get to some questions. A few came in even before I've asked for questions, so I'm going to read some of those off to you. Looks like we've got, did the Jewish people speak Yiddish, Hebrew, or Hungarian?
A very good question. So I often refer, when studying Galicia, linguistic quagmire. So in Galicia, vast majority of Jews spoke Yiddish. Certainly in the first half of 19th century, even earlier, there is a big debate among Jewish community in Galicia. What should be our language? Should that be Yiddish? Should that be ancient language of Hebrew, revived for the literary purposes? Or should that be a German language consistent with Galicia belonging to Austrian Empire, Habsburg monarchy? But vast majority of people spoke Yiddish toward end of 19th century. Younger generation was educated in Polish schools, and a number of Jewish members of community would be fluent in Polish. And very often you would find the families, imagine grandparents speaking Yiddish, parents speaking German, and children speaking Polish. Of course, these were families that understood the other languages very well.
So as usual, not an easy answer.
Yes.
So another question that I have that came in from Ruth, were Jews permitted to go to Vienna in the late 1800s?
Oh, no. There is even a special imperial decree that would mandate that any Jews wishing to go to Vienna at the end of 18th century and beginning of 19th century as well would require special permissions. As you can imagine, Vienna would be the center of the empire. Everybody would like to go. In fact, if we look at the end of 18th century, again, I'm stressing end of 18th century, Jewish community in Vienna, although very affluent, was relatively small. Around 500 Jews were permitted to live in Vienna. Only later, after 1848, after 1850s, in fact, those special permissions to leave Galicia or other provinces of Austrian Empire and travel to Vienna were relaxed. And we find many Galician Jews in Vienna for moving for family reasons, studying in the Vienna University, for example. Adam Barach, that I mentioned, this prolific Jewish physician and writer, he was educated in Vienna and then returned to Lemberg.
Very interesting. Thank you. I'm going to move now to a question from Rabbi Gary Gans, who asks, what were the legal and social consequences of the poisoning of Rabbi Cohn?
Thank you for this question. So, of course, the community was in a state of shock, but events on the streets, the fighting in Lemberg in November, martial law overtook, in a sense, or took attention of the community from assassination of Rabbi Cohn. His assassin was caught. He went to trial, but was released in 1850s on appeal.
Yeah, and that question, I think that person also wanted to get a little bit more information. If you have any kind of sources for that, I'll give you the email address later. Yes. You can give any more information. Another question, sorry. I know that we are running towards the end of our time, but we have a few more good questions. And so I want to see if everyone can stick around with us just a little bit longer. The question came in, how important were the petroleum and alcohol industries in Galicia?
Oh, wow, very good. We can spend entire hours speaking about juice and alcohol, and then juice and oil. So story of oil is a little bit later. It starts in 1860s and 1870s around the city of Drohobych and Borisław. And there was a discovery of oil, shallow deposits of oil and juice were part of the commercial undertaking that made Galicia, by the beginning of 20th century, second or third country, the biggest producer of oil for a brief period of time in the world. Now, coming back to alcohol, yes, so traditionally, again, if we go back to 18th century and even before, the owners of landed estate, the nobility class, generally outsource the production of alcohol to the Jews, the so-called propination or propinatia, and Jews traditionally were involved in production and sale of alcohol. And this continued through the 19th century, even the beginning of 20th century. My grandfather, in fact, was the manager of a distillery as late as the beginning of 20th century. So that's very common occupation for Jews, and also leading to a lot of social conflict in the society, because very often, particularly around the elections, Jews would be accused of distributing alcohol to poor peasants and vilified, of course, and this was much more complex situation that could not be as easily explained.
Right, exactly. And I know that partially it's the immigrant story there.
Yes.
Yes, and that's interesting that you say that, because that is the topic that we'll be talking about next month with Dr. Finkelman. It is very much about the Jews and the types of occupations that they had that turn of the century. So that makes sense. So I'm going to check the chat for just a moment to see what other questions we have. During the 1860s and 70s, did the rift between the Poles and the Ruthenians in Galicia increase further?
Oh, yes, particularly toward the end of 19th century. This was very bitter conflict, and I must say that I think Poles missed the boat, not recognizing the opportunity to embrace Ruthenian national awakening, as it was called. It's very interesting. Today we think that the national identity is centuries old. And Ruthenians did not have a very deep national identity. The beginning of national awakening through words, through books, through literature, through interest in Ruthenian grammar came only in 1830s. And this conflict really coarsened throughout 19th century and 20th century. And in fact, many of you know the Jews were caught very often in the middle in this conflict, and particularly brutal was the Polish-Ukrainian War in the aftermath of World War I in 1919 to 1920.
Thank you. I think we're going to take just one more question before we wrap up today. And the question comes in from Carl. It says, we tend to hear more about Jews bringing radical ideas to America. Did the Galician Jews act on these events after immigration? And I guess he's talking more about Jews from the Russian Empire.
Well, I cannot speak about Russian Empire too much, but about Galicia, I love your question because I just discovered a couple of days ago a listing of Galician Jews, very small, short list, that joined Jews of Vienna, disappointed where the revolution of 1848 is going. And they came with an idea, nach America, to America, movement to emigrate. In fact, those some of those figures from March 1848 that I described to you, those demonstrations, would end up in the United States. They were not as radical once they got to the United States. Joseph Goldmark comes to mind. He was another physician who emigrated shortly, a Jewish physician who emigrated shortly after 1848. So yes, this is the beginning of immigration, but remember that the breakthrough and opening of the floodgates of immigration happened a little bit later with distribution of railroads through Galicia that linked this periphery of the empire with the rest of the Europe.
Fascinating. You know, I'm afraid, I know that there are a couple more questions in our chat, but we've kind of run out of time today. So I apologize to those of you who've asked questions, but perhaps you can send them in your comments and I can forward them on to Dr. Zalewski for later. But I really want to thank you, Doctor. You have been really a delight as usual. Frequently you have spoken at Gratz in our physical building. Today we can't do that, and we usually have a nice crowd there as well. So I'm delighted that you're joining us today in whatever capacity we can do it. It's always good to see you. So
thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you to everyone out there. Thank you for inviting Gratz inside your living rooms, your offices, your dining rooms, and your dens. Have a good night, everybody, or a good afternoon, everybody. Enjoy the weather if it's nice for you. Thank you.